So great. Now we are recording from here onwards. So yeah, welcome again to Local Audit: Why Public Interest Needs to Count, the launch event of our latest report. What we want this evening's discussion to do is firstly to show us the problem that local audit is not working as a result of the privatization of audit itself and the dismantling of the overall regulatory system around it. This is especially serious considering the pressures brought about by austerity, which has put the local government sector in very real risk of failure, as we are already seeing with councils effectively going bankrupt. And secondly, we will provide a short summary of our report that is actually online already. I don't know if any of you have had a look already. But yeah, we argue that audit should be focused on the public interest, and to that end, we have come up with some principles. My colleague Gloria will speak about that later. We'll also, then want to discuss what we can do about this all, because in the absence of audit reform that the government has been planning for a long time, but not actually delivered yet, we want to ask what we can do as local people, journalists, and civil society to create change. And in addition to us at Research for Action, you will hear from Joanna Booth, who is from Bristol, a journalist and very actively investigating Bristol Council in that and other capacities. Joanna, you can give a little wave. Simon is another citizen auditor, Simon Morrow from Lambeth in South London, who will be speaking. He's part of a group called People's Audit, who have written several reports on the poor scrutiny and mismanagement of funds at the council. And then we have two people speaking on whose thinking we have drawn on, who are Steve Goodrich from Transparency International UK and Dr. James Brackley from University of Sheffield. Steve is Transparency International UK's Head of Research and Investigations and is their specialist on corruption in UK politics. And James is a lecturer in accounting, specialising in financial reporting, audit and public sector accounting, and he's also a chartered accountant. They can obviously all say more about their area of expertise. That's it from me. It's great to see you all in the room, as I said, and I will now hand over to Gloria, who will set the scene for tonight's discussion. And also, Gloria, maybe stop. Yep. Oh no, sorry, you've got slides also.
Yeah.
All good. Gloria.
Yeah, that's fine.
Over to you.
I will pause them forthwith. Thanks, Fanny. Thanks for introducing everybody. I'm Gloria. I'm part of the 3 of Research for Action. I'm based in Glasgow and co-author of this report with Megan. So let's go to the worst bit first. Let's see if I can actually. In a second, sorry. I'm immediately having technical issues with my slide sharing.
No, you had the screen shared already.
Yeah,
so
I know.
We just need to go back to the slides.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to do that thing where Zoom offers me itself when I'm trying to actually show the whole slide. So here's this guy, and recently Panorama explored the case of Thurrock Council, where hundreds of millions of pounds were borrowed by the council from other councils in the main, taken by one man, this delightful Liam Kavanagh, for solar farms with barely any return on investment. It's a good show, you should watch it, it's still up on iPlayer. The damage to Thurrock Council's finances has caused it to now be run by Essex Council, and there are further spending cutbacks in an already very deprived area of South England, already austerity hit. There's been barely any oversight in spending at Thurrock, and no one has blown the whistle on what's happened. In this programme on Panorama, Professor Tony Travers said, if the Audit Commission still existed, this probably wouldn't have happened. So good auditing and oversight, we can conclude, could have caught this misuse of public funds at a far earlier stage, or indeed stopped it altogether before nearly £1 billion disappeared. So Thurrock shines a light on the issues of democracy and accountability in local government and makes the headlines, but it's not just about the big headlines, it's the small problems and the oversights in many local authorities that matter too. So the bigger picture. In our report, we argue that there are basically two visions of government in the UK. So there's a vision of privatisation and centralisation, which leads to a compromised form of public accountability. And then there is a vision of genuine democracy underpinned by meaningful transparency and accountability. No surprises for guessing which side the current government is on. And therefore, these forms of government are really totally incompatible with each other. So that's where we start. There's a transformation of local government that's happened since the 1980s, which probably most of us are quite familiar with, which is the shrinking of the state, the centralisation of power, in terms of the way that localism has actually led to more power in the hands of central government in the main. And then this kind of runs alongside and leads to a kind of hollowing out of local government. So, you know, reduced capacity, services, capabilities, and, you know, substance. The government is smaller in itself. So, local audit, what is it? Just a very, very brief guide. So local audit is an annual examination of a local authority's financial statements carried out by an external independent auditor to determine whether they are complying with current regulations and laws. It's an accountability mechanism, and built into it are specific rights for citizens to engage in this process, this includes inspection rights, and the rights to object to local authority accounts. And we'll hear more of that later, no doubt. So this is an important opportunity for democratic scrutiny, and the accountability imperative is strong because it's public money, it's supposed to be used for public good, and we have no choice as users of local government for that money to be spent on us. We can't opt out of being governed. So local audit should be one of the central accountability mechanisms of well-functioning democracy, and a way in which local government can be subject to scrutiny and made answerable for its spending and decision-making. Local audit has not been remade, however, it has been reformed, and we would argue also kind of dismantled, half dismantled, and then half put back together again. So the 2010 coalition government, remember them, sort of began audit reform in England, and this mainly led to the 2014 Local Audit and Accountability Act, which mainly abolished the Audit Commission. And the Audit Commission was an independent public corporation whose role was to manage and oversee the audit of a wide range of bodies, including local government. Now, just to touch on this, the issues that our report and our previous research have raised around democratic deficit and reduced scrutiny are about local government across the UK. But when we're talking about specific audit reforms, we are here talking about the audit reforms affecting England. So just to be aware that audit is devolved. So the Audit Commission was able to uniquely assess and comment on the impact of government policy across local government, and it had independence, expertise, and well-trained and capable staff. So these changes have led to a local and public auditing system that is largely privatised. The responsibility is moved to private providers who offer other types of accounting services, including consultancy. So the big names around here are like Grant Thornton, Mazars, you'll hear those kind of people often. The 2022 White Paper on Audit Reform promised much, but has so far given us very little, and we are still waiting for primary legislation to be put forward in Parliament. Local audit in crisis. So the third part of this is the nub of the thing. There's an agreement across every sector, and including private auditors themselves, the ones I just mentioned, that local audit is not functioning, particularly in England. The number of local audits completed on time is reduced from 97% in 2015 to 12% last year. So that's a drop of from nearly 100% to nearly down to 10%. Delays are not the only problem. The quality of reporting has gone down. The mechanisms by which residents can raise objections have declined. So there's a knock-on effect on decision-making for councillors. Councillors are also struggling because of this. And then this is the context of over a decade in austerity in local government, compounded by the impacts of COVID, which, let's not forget, has also had a really strong impact on local government sector. Councils cutting basic services, facing bankruptcy, the hollowing out that I touched on above. And almost every day in the news, if you follow this area, and sadly I do, there's the story of an English local authority in really dire straits. And today it's Kent. So we now see a fragmented market, fee rises, reluctance to examine serious allegations because of conflicts of interest, not enough providers because there's no incentive to carry out local audits. There are huge skills gaps in both government and local audit firms, audit firms in general, and both auditors and government agree that there's a lack of staffing, capability, competency, etc. Local government cuts have also affected finance workers and back office workers because they'd rather lose those people than lose frontline staff. And this is enmeshed with more subtle changes in culture, so gatekeeping, ignoring requests for information, and treating public inquiries with suspicion. Audit firms themselves are looking for solutions to this crisis. So the head of local government at Grant Thornton, one of the biggest auditors in this sector, said, what is missing is some overarching regime whereby local authority performance is considered. It's not for me to say that the Audit Commission should be back, but that's what the Audit Commission used to do. So this is a quote from him last month. The current government has given no indication as to when they're going to bring this new legislation forward, as I said. So the current setup in local audit, we argue in section 2 of our report, leads to a widening accountability gap. In local government, there's been a reduction in transparency, so a reduction to access to relevant, understandable and timely information, and there's been a reduction in scrutiny, so the opportunities to question and challenge decision-making processes. There have been big changes in culture, capacity and expertise, and more power is held in fewer hands. So on this list, this is the kind of list of the sort of components of this accountability gap as we see it. So the private sector usurping public interests, private firms have become involved in advice, consultancy and audit. So they're involved in both sides of delivery in local government, which leads to conflicts of interest. And there's a changed role and scope of audit and audit culture. So there's no incentive for private firms to do public-led audits because they're still working for profit. There's less openness and transparency. This leads to less audit. This is kind of a snake eating its tail in some ways. And there are different kinds of audit. There are fewer kind of value for money type, deeper forms of audit that the Audit Commission was more involved in. The public and civil society are excluded from audit accountability. This is kind of a big thing for us, and this is what our previous research is focused on as well. Part of this is the creation of private companies to deliver public services. So, local authority will create effectively a means to privatize its own work. So, for example, in Lambeth, it's housing. Simon can talk about that, which means that there's political control, but there's no political scrutiny. And this kind of privatization function is really important, we think. And there's also a reduction in sanction and regulation. So there's a limited right to appeal in the Local Audit and Accountability Act. One person pursued a complaint with their council's auditor for nearly 5 years. Most of that time has been spent trying to establish which body would be responsible for dealing with the complaint, simply dealing with it. All this leads to a greater risk of corruption, mismanagement, and poor decision-making. So Steve will no doubt talk more about this. But just a quote from Transparency International, the confluence of changes they predicted that the confluence of changes to audit regulation of local government and austerity have created an enabling environment for corruption. So just to sum this up for now, the neoliberal transformations, so the three transformations I was talking about at the beginning of local government and local audit are closely entwined. The private interests overshadow the public interests, the capacity for scrutiny and challenge at all levels has been reduced, and there's less openness and transparency in both. These conditions are effectively excluding the public and wider society from holding power to account. And our research and our experience and the experience of people in this room shows that there is basically no meaningful mechanism for enforcement or appeal on these rights, information rights. So audit now needs to be transformed and not just reformed. And it needs to be framed through the lens of democracy and public interest. And I'm going to talk more about that. But first, I'm going to hand over to Joanna, who is going to share some insights about demanding accountability as a citizen and as a journalist. So I'll stop sharing for now when I find my mouse.
Hi, if you're happy for me to start. I'm Joanna, and I'm a citizen journalist, kind of specifically citizen journalist in Bristol. My idea is very much that I should be able to know what's happening in my city from what's published and what from the council does. And leaping off from the report that's just being published, I really like. I mean, I always like that quote about how armchair auditors will now leap into the fray, and they will take down councils, they'll point out inaccuracies. So I'm kind of basing my experience around that point. What can armchair auditors do, and what have I done to kind of show the limits of it? So this is my 4th year as an armchair auditor as such, and I've managed to get invoices from Bristol City Council, from the West of England Combined Authority, and from Manchester City Council. This has been progressively getting harder, but in various ways. So the first year, the council was more kind of not confused, but it's like more befuddled. Say, yeah, fine, you can have all these invoices. Are you sure you want all these invoices? You're not going to get much. And I said, yes, please, thank you. Send me 4,000 invoices. And they did. And they sent me some reports. The second year, they were not as amenable. And that year, I managed to put in 2 public interest reports as well. But I get to those. So the third year, they says, no, you can't have these. You can't have about 8.7 million of these invoices because they're grants. So I had to argue my case until November last year. And then finally, I managed to get the bulk of the invoices I asked for. But by the time I got through everything they sent me, after many arguments and many kind of invoking of lawyers, they hadn't sent me the reports, but they did send me the bulk of what I needed. And this year, I managed to talk to the finance person, which we now have quite a kind of amenable relationship. And he insists to me that he's fine with giving me invoices. It's not a problem. But everything else is kind of has to go through legal, and other people are not so amenable. I've been talking to this guy for 4 years now. So that's kind of the access part, which not everyone has the ability to access invoices, which I also tell Bristol City Council. So I've managed to get to a certain extent what I needed or what they can give me. But then what happens? So the first year, I had 2 cases where, the spending just seemed inappropriate. One was, a tiny amount compared to what auditors actually look like. That's £5,000, and that was dismissed. That was advertising in the local paper. And the other one was for £30,000 a year for spying on Twitter, on social media. And again, that was dismissed. And it took about 2-3 months to get those through Grant Thornton, who are our auditors. It used to be BDO. The second year of putting in public interest report, or asking for public interest reports and putting in objections for 2 of them, I've still to hear about. This was done last July following complaint. And this is about 2 contracts issued to a cabinet member for a program she oversees. And I still haven't heard, and that was officially accepted last November. And the other one was just at the deadline of the financial year, and about the mayor offloading some Bristol property to his boxing club without registering it, worth 1.35 million. And I'm still waiting for both. So it's been since November, December, it's 3/4 of a year. And Grant Thornton have accepted both of these, but I've not heard back. The first 2 were dismissed. The other part that also came up in the report was about companies that councils create. Part of it is to make profit, because that's very much what they've been left to do. They've been hollowed out, as the report states. So our first company was Bristol Energy, which is a very similar scenario to the Thurrock situation in terms of the financial advisors, and actually scrutiny in our case, advised cabinet, who are our executive under a mayoral system, including the mayor, to not approve the business plan, but it was approved. And the second one was an FOI to Bristol Waste, who are currently under investigation for fraud. And it was for something very, very basic. It was an FOI about their directors' expenses, because they've had 3 directors leave within 2 years. And they just said no. They just, it wasn't even a matter of finding the right, section of the legislation. They just said, no, we're not going to do that, twice. So I put that in April or March. and the ICO accepted it in June, but they still haven't provided a case officer for it. And so that's been, what is it? What, you know, I imagine it's going to be 6 months until someone from the ICO is even appointed to it. And considering that our system changes and our mayor is leaving and the cabinet, a lot of the cabinet leaving next May, you know, we're at a point now where anyone who puts in an objection or an FOI could legitimately expect not to receive anything, because that's just how long the process takes. So I've put in a couple of complaints, as I mentioned, and I just wanted to mention this as the last part of what actually happens. Say you get your invoices, you get your reports, you make the complaints, you go to the auditors. What happens then? Well, so far nothing has happened. The objections haven't come through. The media, who are meant to be the fourth estate, haven't picked any of it up. They were actually at the cabinet meeting where the land was disposed of to the mayor's boxing club, and that also didn't get picked up. The other objection, and a complaint that was upheld, but that also hasn't seen the light of day kind of in the media. So, sorry, I should point out that both objections against the mayor and the cabinet member for their contracts have gone to the monitoring officer, who has become a very politicized person and has dismissed one entirely, just would not accept a complaint against the mayor at all. And they kind of, they accepted the complaint about the cabinet member, but then didn't oversee it, didn't pursue it. So that's kind of, I'll wrap up now, but it's very interesting to see how these kind of armchair auditors have risen up, like me, but then nothing actually is possible in reality. Sorry, I'll finish there.
Thank you. Greatly your time. Thanks, Joanna. Thanks so much for sharing that experience, because it is always so illuminating to hear from people who are really battling the kind of nitty-gritty of this in their local councils, kind of day and week and month, you know, at a time. Right, I will pass back to Gloria now for some slightly bigger picture findings.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Fanny. So I'm going to go back to the slides. So that was my last one, and hopefully, ooh, right, here we go. So I think Joanna's really nicely given a sort of detailed experience of several points at which citizens and journalists try to make interventions into this system and understand what is actually quite complex information at the appropriate time that they're allowed to, and then are, you know, thrown into the wastes. And there's a kind of, you know, that we're told that we're not allowed to say that public interest is what the public is interested in, but up to a point there is some truth in that. And so I wanted to kind of go into how we got to the sort of third section of this report, which is like local audit in the public interest. So local audit isn't working. It doesn't provide accountability. It doesn't pick up on corrupt behaviours, and it doesn't identify weak governance and risky decision making. And we see that a lot. Instead, it's doing other things. It's consolidating the audit and the auditor's role as a narrow exercise to enforce the ongoing kind of ways of counting money and also austerity. So the assessment of local authorities purely on their financial viability, as opposed to like whether they're delivering, you know, things for the public good. They're narrowing the scope of what audit could be. They're supporting further centralisation and removing control of local government, and supporting more central government intervention into local government. So it'd be interesting to talk about that in more detail, but just to move into kind of the definitions of public interest. So public interest is important because it's an actual framework that's codified for the disclosure of hidden or obscure information relating to government. We've seen that in the way that the Freedom of Information Act has transformed the way people think about information rights and the public interest. This means there are formal channels for challenging and scrutinising information revealed by accountability mechanisms such as audit. At the same time, the public interest framework is extremely limited, and you know, one example of this is public interest reports, which Joanna touched on and other people will probably mention, which is, you know, an accountability mechanism by which the public can raise concerns about local authority accounts to the auditor. So, and the auditors can also carry out their own public interest reports, but the criteria for conducting an investigation in the public interest is often not followed. And in reality, they're seldom used by auditors, and they're almost never in response to public concerns, people like Joanna and Simon. Public spending and local government assets are also a public resource, as I mentioned, and so the public should be involved in the both decision making and accountability over those assets and resources. So we came up with some principles and recommendations, and these are really, we tried to really derive them from like what we actually read and think about, and the research and the pieces of research that Research for Action have also carried out before. So first one is accountability starts with transparency, and therefore disclosure of all relevant information in government spending is crucial. For example, council-owned companies should be subject to audit, and external audit should be also covered by Freedom of Information Act. So people should be able to FOI request on documents that auditors have considered. Robust scrutiny and challenge is encouraged. So, we know that supporting and valuing scrutiny means also funding and resourcing it well, not just saying it's a good thing, but actually backing it. So we think that local government audit committees should be made statutory full committees again, but they should also have the remit and extra resources to oversee corruption, risk assessments, and investigative powers. Powerful regulation improves governance. An accountable local audit regime requires regulation where standards are clear and expectations are clear and clearly enforced. So in practice, a national audit and reporting body needs to have capacity to collect nationwide data on fraud and corruption. We haven't seen any of that in the draft legislation, in the white paper. Public interest over conflict of interest. So, there are conflicts of interest in the privatisation of audit commission, as I mentioned, and that undermines the public nature of audit as a public good. So one remedy for that would simply be that audit should not be carried out by the private sector, and we suggest that in the report. The protection of public resource is central to local government. So, local government are dealing with a lot of the very basic needs of their populations, and these services should be considered the property of the public. And for the purposes of their well-being. So for audit, this means forming an independent national body with a remit that has the same level as the Audit Commission for carrying out regular investigations on cross-cutting issues, for example, health and social care, and the cost of different issues across different local authorities and even regions. Accountability needs public engagement. This is our big thing, and this is a big part of what we do in support in Research for Action. It's necessary to have a wide range of civil society actors and councillors also from all parties actively encouraged and able to participate in audit and scrutiny. This makes it better and more valid. So one way this could be enlarged is through the formation of the idea of regional public accounts committees or local public accounts committees. So Simon will talk more about the principles of transparency and robust scrutiny a bit further on, and I think James and Steve will also have things to say about the public interest in their ways, so I'm going to leave it there for now, but there's a lot of density in those recommendations. I just wanted to kind of set out the stall before we go further on, and just say that this is actually a question of democracy and democratic space. So there was a recent report by the Sheila McKechnie Foundation called Defending Our Democratic Space, and I think it's really worth a read if you've got time. They call the democratic space where people in civil society organisations help shape the policies, services, laws and cultural norms that affect all our lives. And this space is under increasing constraint due to this government's laws, practices and regulations. And our transparency has been downgraded massively in the last few years by international monitors. And there are actually common concerns across the political spectrum about the lack of transparency, access to information, political accountability, and the domination of vested interests. All of these obviously relate to how we've been talking about local audit. There's a wider political struggle about defending this space, and I think it's really important that we say that. But going back to audit itself, as we say in the conclusion, audit doesn't just monitor and assess values, it actively constructs them. And if it's left up to government and the private sector purely to decide what to prioritise, then that will not change. The audit will not change. And the transformation of audit has to centre the public and its role in scrutiny. And it's ambitious, but it's entirely possible. And we see that kind of movement in the way that, for example, radical municipalist movements in other countries have examined local government, moved into local government and transformed it. Politicians aren't moving on this. So what can we do in the meantime? We know that the public make continued efforts to participate, even when this is difficult work. Citizen auditors and researchers are showing the way, and I think we should, big ourselves up for doing that. And these efforts to investigate and to challenge over audit should mean something. So we want public interest in local audit to count. That's the last word of the report. But if you want the finer details, then you should definitely read it.
Great, thanks so much, Gloria, for that. Just to point everybody to the fact that in the chat that report about the shrinking democratic space has been shared. So if anybody wants to have a look at that, please do. There's also in the chat a link to our report if you haven't read it yet. So, but yeah, we will keep posting that. So no worries if you don't if you haven't yet noticed it. I also want to sort of draw your attention to something that Gwen said earlier. Gwen from York has been very active also as a citizen auditor, and has actually managed to get a couple of public interest reports out of the council. So if you are interested in the topic of public interest, it's also worth following her on Twitter. She did post her Twitter handle in the meeting chat earlier, but Gwen, maybe you want to do that again. Anyway, I think that's the kind of chat update for now. I have seen also a couple of questions that I will read out in due course. But yeah, let's crack on with hearing, sort of going out wider. We next have Steve telling us a bit more about the kind of wider transparency context. And yeah, really glad to have Steve here, because we have Transparency International UK is one of the organisations whose work we kind of keep quoting when we want to describe what has already been found out about the sort of corruption risk as a result of some of the changes in local government that have been happening over the last decade and a bit. So thanks a lot, Steve. Over to you.
Thank you, Fanny. I think some of the credits are also slightly deserving of Liz Barrett, who authored our sort of last major piece of work on this back, the sort of prophetical piece of work on this back in 2013, corruption in local government and mounting risk. So credit where credit's due. So I work at Transparency International UK. We're an anti-corruption organisation, and we define corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And so in our context, there was often attempts by us and our partners in civil society and government, business and elsewhere, to try and help deal with abuses of power, which tend to often involve some sort of form of conflict of interest between the sort of the public interest and a private one. So what does this mean in practice? It sounds all quite sort of academic, and defining public interest is not always immediately straightforward. It can be sort of contested, and as Gloria said at the start, it's not necessarily just about what the public are interested in. It can be a range of things. So, but some of them are relatively self-evident. So, for example, quality and affordable housing. I think most people would recognise that as something that there's a public interest in investing in, as opposed to dangerous and extremely expensive housing, which those who are experiencing the trauma of the current cladding scandal and leasehold crises in the country will appreciate, and the wider housing crises. A better environment, being able to go swimming in your local river or sea without fear of being deluged by raw sewage. It's a public interest to have a decent environment as well. Or securing, in an audit context, it's often more talking about securing value for money, making sure that taxpayers' funds are used efficiently and effectively to advance these sort of broader outcomes that I've just talked about. Alongside, and as part of that, increasing knowledge about the use of power is also key to advancing the public interest in this context. So to flip it on its the other side, what would be the opposite of it? And there's a few examples that have been mentioned already, and this could be sort of the transfer of property or land on the basis of criteria that does not use merit or need, but on the basis of patronage, on the basis of who you know, a friend, a close associate, a business partner. In most circumstances, someone who's given you a bribe or some form of incentive, financial or equivalent, to make a decision that benefits a private individual or private company at the expense of the wider public good. It could be the embezzlement of public funds, and sort of that's in its most extreme form, which is thankfully quite rare in the UK, but actually still does happen on a large enough scale for us to be concerned about. Or the award of contracts, again, not on the basis of who's best to deliver that good or service, but on some other criteria, whether it be political connections or other. And then I'm sure some examples may jump to mind from recent news coverage. So just quickly taking a step back, there was this sort of framework, there's laws and policies and processes to try and stop these kind of like malign activities happening. But what we've seen since 2010 is a sort of what may have been well-intentioned in some regards, but ultimately flawed reforms to sort of change the sort of framework and the governance that would sort of prevent these kind of activities taking place. One of them being the Localism Act, which sort of turned what was essentially a core set of standards for how councillors conducted themselves into a more threadbare set of basic rules. The introduction of rail development corporations, which, you know, in theory would be a good idea to help redevelop difficult pieces of land to develop. A lot of this report focuses on the abolition of the Audit Commission and the framework of that, so I won't go into too much detail there. But also alongside that, there's the introduction of new transparency codes to produce more sort of data, and, you know, that would create information to hold public bodies to account at the local level. And, you know, this all driven by the sort of localism agenda and sort of, you know, in theory, sort of empowering people at the local level to hold politicians and public officials to account, but also saying that, you know, local knows best in all circumstances, and that you know, you're able to shape things like codes of conduct for elected officials to suit the local needs. But unfortunately, I think, you know, in terms of looking at this now with you know, a good sort of 10+ years of hindsight, there were at least sort of 5 flawed assumptions in this thinking. When it comes to the sort of devolution of the standards regime, the assumption that standards wouldn't just result in a patchwork of poor practice is proven to be wrong. And we did a piece of work looking at the use of the sort of the robustness of council safeguards against impropriety in the planning process, and the results of that were pretty terrifying, especially given the context of a number of police investigations into the misuse of public resources or the award of public land or planning decisions that may have been unduly influenced by bribery, and Northampton being one of them, and Liverpool also springs to mind. The second sort of flawed assumption, and this has been touched on earlier, is that armchair auditors would have access to all of the information they needed to actually be able to hold public bodies and the decisions they made to account, and that they had the competency and the resources to actually use the information they were given. And it sounds like there's, from what we've seen in previous research and hearing from others, like Research for Action, is that, you know, there are some pockets of good practice, but they're the exception more than the rule, and no real substitute for you know, well-resourced, trained, qualified auditors. But, you know, a good thing, but definitely not plugging the hole that was left by the Audit Commission. And also there was a point I think was touched upon earlier as well around being able to access information through the Freedom of Information Act. If you have a privatised service, you know, you cannot get access to information about them, even if they're essentially undertaking a public function. And that's something we've been banging the drum about for years. Third flawed assumption is that authorities would be both competent and willing to provide the information that's requested of them. And again, I think Joanna sort of touched on this quite well, provided a very good example there. We've had similar experience. in relation to Liverpool specifically, where we asked for stuff that about the planning decisions in data form that we could then interrogate in a more time efficient manner, and they just simply refuse to do this, even though they're legally obliged to do so. You ask any journalist who sort of tries to interrogate, whether it be at the local or national level, actually, it can be like getting blood out of a stone, and it really shouldn't be, given that there are legal obligations to hand this information over. But also, when they do publish it, and we noticed this with information about public spending or the award of contracts, is that it's done so badly often that it's quite hard, even for trained professionals like ourselves, to actually make sense of what's published and linking the award of a contract through to actual spend against that contract value, which really you should be able to do, but it's often lacking. The fourth is that cutting the cost of audit wouldn't cut the quality and timeliness of audits, and Gloria again sort of mentioned that the sort of policy in that logic, or that there'll be no conflicts of interest arising from the new commissioning arrangements, which again is proven to be flawed. And then the fifth one is that, and this has been talked about earlier as well, that putting local authorities under increasing financial pressure, whether it be because of austerity or COVID, as Gloria mentioned, wouldn't increase the risk significantly. And then, the upshot of all of this is, we are talking about billions of pounds of public money at risk here. And whether it's through corruption, which is our primary area of interest, or through incompetence, thank you, Fanny, these are eye-watering amounts of money that could be put towards things like the homes that people need, the greener, cleaner streets and environments that we all need, that can help mitigate the impacts of climate change, or the schools and the healthcare that we all deserve, and that would be advancing the public interest. Anyway, I'll wrap it there. Just to put things in a broader context of why this matters, and whilst audit might sound a bit dry, it really is fundamentally like one of the key lines of defence against the abuse of interested power for private gain, and the waste of public resources that could be spent on advancing the public interest. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Steve, for putting that all so well and into that context of why it really matters. We will next hear from Simon, who can also tell us a bit about why these things matter from the perspective of Lambeth, and we'll also talk from the perspective of citizen audits and these principles that Gloria has introduced us to.
Hi, thanks for asking me to speak. I was just going to talk through some of the principles and how they've kind of operated in practice, or not operated, as the case may be in Lambeth. In terms of transparency, I mean, People's Audit really started as a result of a council that was completely out of control. The Labour Party won a huge majority in 2014. There were only sort of 4 opposition councillors, I think, and they just decided to do whatever they wanted. They weren't in the slightest bit interested in the financial implications or whether residents wanted what they were going to do. And, had people been open and actually engaged with people, a lot of the subsequent problems that have arisen could have been avoided. In terms of sort of scrutiny, I mean, and also engagement, some of these issues, quite a few of the people involved in People's Audit are finance professionals. I'm a chartered surveyor. We have a Harvard graduate. We have an ex-chief financial officer. We warned Lambeth years and years ago that their business plans weren't robust. We gave them a whole list of questions for the councillors to ask. Not a single one of them got asked. And, I think the frustrating thing I noticed in the chat, we can chat later, but somebody had asked, has anybody at Thurrock, for example, been sort of charged with corruption? I think the problem we find is that absolutely nobody, because the system is so broken, there's no way to hold people to account. The things have gone horribly wrong in many departments in Lambeth, and the politicians move on, the officers move on, and nobody actually takes responsibility. So, robust scrutiny, it just pays so much dividends. We in Lambeth, we have an audit and scrutiny committee, and one of the opposition councillors pushed to get like an external person involved, and he was a real boon. He was sort of the only adult in the room, if you like, and he asked lots of probing questions of officers, but after a year he's given up. I think probably just got a bit frustrated that he wasn't being listened to. And it's also frustrating from a point of view of a member of the public, is that you have a lot of councillors, and again, they'll sign things off, but there's no way to sort of hold them responsible for their decisions, even though they haven't got a clue what they're looking at, and don't seem kind of quite nervous to even ask for help. They'll have the floor at any meeting to talk for as long as they like, yet members of the public, who in many cases know a lot more about what's going on than the officers or the politicians, have 2 minutes, and that's kind of that's all you can say. So it would be really good if councils had, in similar way that Parliament has inquiries, where you could bring the expertise into the room and really sort of drill down into what the issues are. So yeah, I mean, I think, and then we've sort of covered scrutiny, and also regulation. I mean, the system is so broken in terms of, we have tried absolutely everything apart from going to the police, and you just kind of get nowhere. You've just reminded me, actually, my complaint to the Institute of Chartered Accountants is now, okay, got it. Now I've been with them for 2.5 years. So I'll just finish up again. It's interesting. There's actually no definition of what is in the public interest. So a lot of these accountants who are kind of supposed to be deciding these matters don't actually have any policy themselves. Neither KPMG or Mazars, who I've dealt with, have any policy to define what it actually means. So you're kind of purely dependent on what sort of side of the bed the accountant got out of, as to whether you kind of strike lucky or not. So all right, I'll leave it at that. But okay, hopefully I'm just within my time. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Simon.
Thanks.
It's always good to hear from you. You might have heard from Simon before if you've attended one of our events before, because we have been sort of working together and in parallel for many years, and I've been following things like this complaint that Simon mentioned. Actually, Simon, somebody's asking in the chat if that complaint is online, and if so, if you can send a link. But yeah, Simon can probably share. But yeah, maybe people can get in touch with you directly also, Simon, if people want to hear more about this. Is that okay? Yeah, Simon's giving thumbs up. Great. Cool. So let's move forward and yeah, hear a bit more about the audit landscape and what audit is actually supposed to do from James now, and a bit more. Yeah, over to you, James.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, and to all the speakers so far. Yeah, so my name's James Brackley. I teach accounting and auditing, was at the University of Birmingham, now at University of Sheffield. And I was an auditor in practice a number of years ago with on the dark side. I was with PwC, and I was auditing a couple of councils actually in my time, about 10 years ago now. I think, first of all, the report itself that you've produced here is absolutely fantastic. It's a compelling read. It's got some fantastic recommendations in there, and the way you've sort of picked that apart in terms of all of the different things we can look at and do differently, I think is a crucial contribution. I know there's a public inquiry kind of looking at this at the moment. There's obviously potentially a general, well, there is, I think, a general election next year, isn't there? And this is against the wider background of audit scandal, not just in local authority. There's a real issue with how audit is done just across the entire economy. All sorts of scandals, from accounting scandals at Tesco, corporate collapses at Carillion, and so on and so forth. I wanted to just touch on a few things, I suppose. In terms of the audit market, you call quite directly for basically an end to privatisation, nationalisation, essentially, in all but name of audit provision in local government. And I think that's absolutely the right call. It's really not as really controversial at all. There's something called the Redmond Review, which talks about how the market really isn't working. It's fragmented. There's a lack of skills. There's a lack of capacity. There's far too much risk. The audit firms don't really like taking these on. In my time at PwC, just before I left, they made the strategic decision not to even tender really for, I think they did put in an initial tender, but they basically completely stepped out of the local government market when the audit commission stuff was all put out to tender, and they say, we're just going to let this play out. And they didn't even want to enter the market at that time. And I think for all the reasons you highlight in the report, there's an inherent conflict of interest, essentially, with audit provision. Auditors work for management. It has drastically reduced the cost. If you look at how much we pay the auditors, it's probably less than it might have been under the audit commission. But, if you don't want to pay for audit, you can reduce that cost to zero and just not have any audit. That completely defeats the purpose if that's the only thing that this has achieved. So yeah, I think that's an important call. In terms of value for money as well. So the auditors, they check the accounts in theory, and they also have a value for money conclusion. Now, what that doesn't do is really use the independent world leading expertise to give proper financial advice to the council. That's not really what it's about. They audit whether arrangements are in place, essentially. So a lot of the time that reduces the value for money to basically box ticking, or have they got certain procedures in place? And that's falls way short of what the audit commission were doing, what a proper public body could do if they were seriously looking at value for money. Then one other thing I wanted to touch on was in terms of the accounting treatment that we've got going on. If anybody's had the unfortunate displeasure of having to pick up a set of local authority accounts, they're incredibly difficult to read and interpret. They're quite non-standard, the way they have the different columns. You have the accounting basis and then the funding basis. And then you have all the cost centres and then the taxation separately disclosed underneath and all of this nonsense. But perhaps the bigger issue even than all of that is council accounts are sort of set up to look at how they spend the reserves, and they have a lot of freedom to move money around within the reserves. And another problem with the accounting is kind of linked to all the stuff you touch on in the report in terms of the neoliberalisation of local government. Councils have been freed up to borrow quite aggressively, and they've been freed up to sort of invest in all sorts of things. And particularly, in the case of Thurrock, borrowing to speculate, and even putting any sort of question of fraud to one side. That is absolutely not the business of a local authority to be heavily borrowing in order to speculate. They're not an investment bank. They're there to serve the people of the community. But that ties into the accounting, because if you look at the balance sheet of Thurrock, they've got close to about £900 million of short-term financial assets that they've invested in, and a corresponding amount, about £900 million of loans that they've borrowed to make those investments. The most recent set of accounts for Thurrock, and this is shocking, is March 2021, 2.5 years ago, not audited. So we're 3.5 years since we've had an audit of Thurrock. And you look at their accounts and they've got £500,000 surplus, looks good. They've booked a load of profit essentially from these financial assets because they've adopted a very aggressive form of fair value accounting where they're booking fair value accounting movements through the P&L. It's called fair value through P&L. It was heavily criticised in the sort of banking crisis. in terms of why, you know, the balance sheets of a lot of the banks were overstated in 2007. So again, you've got this sort of aggressive accounting treatment. You've got accounts that need just the accounting standards need to be completely rewritten, in my opinion. So I think that's where your call for sort of a new regulator, you know, the ARGA to, you know, the Audit Reporting and Governance Authority, to come in and look at all of this stuff, I think is a crucial call as well. So yeah, so you've got this sort of complex accounting treatment, this sort of system of audit that's not really working for anybody. And I think, yeah, you just laid that out fantastically well in the report. They were the sort of main things I wanted to cover. As I say, I did do a bit of audit in practice now. I teach audit as well. So some of this case study stuff that we teach with our students, and we get our students looking at this stuff, is quite eye-opening as well. So yeah, I think I'm a few minutes under, but I'll maybe leave it there. And if people have got more questions, I can come in.
Thanks a lot, James. Yeah, obviously, welcome to leave it there. It was fascinating to listen to you. I always really enjoy hearing from people who have actually been inside that industry and know it from a completely different perspective, because, yeah, like you say, some of the accounting standards and even, you know, language and definitions around it can feel quite impenetrable, and that's obviously a big part of the problem with this supposed kind of armchair auditor narrative. We are just a couple of minutes past 8 o'clock now, and I promised you a break around 8 o'clock, so we will take a strictly 5-minute break now. Let's come back at 7 past. Yeah, we will go into the discussion straight after the break. So yeah, prepare questions. Yeah, speakers, maybe you can already have a look at the questions that were posted in the chat, or if you need a break, obviously take a break. But we'll pause the recording now, so that we won't. But if you can restart the recording, thanks. We just wanted to record this so that we kind of can end the publishable recording on a nice note, and now that isn't the recording, sorry about that. Yeah, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody, to the speakers, and to everybody who participated in the conversation. And yeah, I definitely found this really interesting and stimulating and intellectually challenging, and I hope you did too. We will continue working on this topic, and yeah, we want this report to be useful for kind of raising the pressure also on the government, ensuring that public audit is given some kind of adequate consideration in the process of audit reform once that is forthcoming, and of course, you know, put pressure on the next government, as I think yeah, somebody mentioned earlier, there will be an election very likely next year. Also, as James mentioned, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, note the absence of local government in that name, by the way, has an inquiry ongoing, and will report at some point in the autumn. So that's another kind of point of intervention if anybody is interested in kind of forming a wider coalition of groups to put pressure on, you know, commenting on these issues, putting them on the government's radar. And of course, we want the report to be useful for anyone working in this space, you know, in the capacity of a campaigner or in the capacity of journalist. We really, yeah, want to support local journalists to understand these issues better, and are really up for working with. I think there was somebody here who said they are a journalist. So yeah, please do get in touch. I have just put in the chat our yeah, contact details. You can follow us on Twitter, Mastodon, email at info@researchforaction.uk if you want to get in touch about anything. We also host sort of roughly monthly meetings of a citizen auditor network, where people like us and Joanna and Simon can come together and share experiences and tips and support, which is a nice space because, as we've all heard, you know, there can be quite a lot of hostility and frustration when you're working scrutinizing local government. It's not a sort of fixed group. There's no kind of commitment or affiliation. It's just a space for support and sharing. So again, please do get in touch if you would like to know about those meetings. Yeah, there's a bunch of other work and research that we are doing in this area of accountability and scrutiny, such as speaking to people within councils about their experiences, identifying barriers to scrutiny, as well as best practice. Like I already said, supporting local journalists. Yeah, and then just a bunch of other stuff, working with local campaigners in Sheffield and Glasgow on a project that looks at democratizing governance. We're part of international networks on local democracy and municipalism, but as we are 2 minutes past 8:30 already, I'm not going to go further into that. I am just going to point you to all those contact details on the screen so that you can follow us and look at our website to find out more about our work. And I'm going to say, once again, thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and yeah, really hope that you enjoyed this as much as we did.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much for the speakers. You all had such great insights. Really appreciate it. Remember to read our report.